All right, welcome back, and this is my little Nikon Z50 video. The Nikon Z50, well, before I say anything else, this video is not sponsored by Square Place or Square Peg or anything like that. It's just sponsored by me and whatever advertisements YouTube happens to throw your way, and appreciate you for sitting through that. I think it was, you get 5 seconds, you can skip past it anyway. So the Nikon Z50, I've got several things to go over here and just my thoughts on the camera itself after using it for a while, and using the Nikon Z7, which I'm recording this with now, with a Nikon 24-70 f4 S lens, the Z mount lens, and 1080 60p. So I've got some thoughts. I want to try to keep it as short as I can, but also kind of talk about some of the beginner type things, because Z50, there'll be a lot of maybe some beginners or people who are not really that familiar with photography and what all this stuff means when we're talking about the Z50 and the different features compared to other cameras. So let me just jump right into it. But first, if there's any pictures you want to see, I'll have a lot of pictures in my gallery. I don't put the pictures in my videos because I just try to do all this in one take. And you can view the pictures really big on my website, so I'll put that link in the description. And camera's only about a week or two old for me, so there's some pictures from a couple of short trips that I've got in there already, but I'll have a lot of pictures from just general shooting and any trips I go on here in the next month or two. And definitely by spring there's a really big trip down south, a lot of places, and so it'll be a bunch of pictures in there from that. So the Z50, I've got it in this little JJC neoprene case. I'm trying to get the face out of there so the face detect doesn't pick it up. So this little neoprene case from JJC fits it really well. I'll try to find it and put the link on down in the description again, but it's like $15 or whatever. Just got a little flap down here with Velcro, and it fits the camera really well. So the Z50, I bought it with the 2 kit lenses, the 16-50, which is the lens that's on the camera right now, and which is a collapsible lens, and I do have a JJC lens hood on there. The collapsible lens, it's a 16-50, so that's a full frame equivalent if you're not familiar with that, like a regular 35mm DSLR type camera. Back in the film days, a 35 millimeter film frame, the equivalent focal length for this 16-50 would be like a 24 to 75 millimeter. So it's just kind of a standard zoom range, and 24 is pretty wide, so you can be indoors and get a lot of, a lot of the scene indoors with 24 millimeter. A lot of the kit lenses start at like 28 millimeter equivalent. So right away, that's nice that it's a 16-50, so that gives you a 24 to 75 equivalent. And the 50 to 250, 50 millimeter to 250 millimeter. This is like a 75 to 375, so that's a big zoom range. And this is another one of those lenses that kind of collapses down when you put it on the camera. You have to, this is the collapsed stored way it is, and then when you pop it out to start shooting, you have to do this to get it to 50 millimeters, and then you can start shooting and then zoom from there out to 250 millimeter. So try not to spend too much time about what it is, because you've probably seen a lot of videos about that. This, by the way, is the Nikon lens hood. It's about $35. There's a JJC version. It looks like a clone of it. It's probably $14. You haven't noticed already, I mentioned JJC several times. They do make a lot of nice, good quality lens hoods, stuff like that, if you don't want to spend the money. Nikon usually provides lens hoods for their cameras, but for these less expensive models, sometimes they don't, and they don't for the 2 kit lenses that come with the Z50. So this JJC lens hood for the 16-50 is about, it's a screw-on type and it's metal. It was like $15 or something like that. The other thing you don't get is nice lens caps. So the lens cap that comes on the end of the lenses is this kind of a clear plastic one that just kind of pops over it. And if you want to get the regular Nikon version that twists on, which I'd highly recommend, that's only $4.50. So, get those. And I have the 24-120 f4 f-mount lens. This is the Z mount, the FTZ adapter, and you can mount that on the camera. Basically, it the FTZ adapter is about as big as the 16 to 50 lens, so you figure that that's going to be sticking out about right there. Probably going to get rid of this 24 to 120 because now Nikon announced the 24 to 200 millimeter lens, which would be a nice all-around travel lens for me. So now we'll get into the the Z50 and what I like about it. It is super lightweight and really small with that kit lens on there, and the kit lenses are really good optically. They're much better than like the standard kit lenses that Nikon used to have with like 1855 or whatever with their DSLRs, you know. So optically they are much better, and I was surprised how good they are optically. They do have image stabilization, or Nikon calls it VR, vibration reduction. So if you've got a little camera shake, you know, it helps out with that. When you have a slower shutter speed, you know, and you know, as it getting closer to evening or early morning when it's not really bright out, that's where the vibration reduction will come in handy. I use my own personal limit is about 1/15 of a second, so I usually set my auto ISO. But ISO is like how sensitive the sensor is to light. So the higher the ISO, the more sensitive it is to light, and you can shoot in the dark more. But you do get that noise with ISO. The higher settings in ISO, and also the higher ISO you go, the more dynamic range you lose. So I try to keep it. I usually limit it to about 1600, which is just what I always do. No reason why I couldn't go higher on the Z50. It's really good high ISO quality. Otherwise, you get that noise in the picture. Some people object to it, some people don't. But the noise and the dynamic range from the sensor, you know, it's really good. I think compared to the Nikon D500, which we think is where the sensor came from, they added the phase detect points on the sensor, and according to DxO, it has about 14 stops of dynamic range, whereas the nice full frame cameras are maybe around 14 and a half or so, or between 14 and a half to 15 for the very best ones. Like the Z7 is closer to 15 stops of dynamic range, and it helps out with having nice smooth transitions between the highlights and shadows in the picture, and also being able to do your editing if you're going to edit RAW files instead of JPEG files from the camera. There's a lot more latitude, with the editing, and still having a nice looking picture instead of it just looking crazy like you really overcooked it. But these two kit lenses are really good optically. People complain that it's f6.3 for the aperture when you're zoomed all the way out. Same thing with the 50 to 250. But I think for the target audience for these, and probably not going to be in super dark conditions all the time anyway, and so the wider aperture, a bigger opening for people who don't know, it's good. Like a f1.8 is a really wide aperture, and f6.3 is closed down more, so you get less light. You'd want a wider aperture lens when it's darker outside, or if you want a more shallow depth of field, because that's the other thing the wide aperture affects is the depth of field. If you have a small opening, you get more of the image in focus, and if you have the really wide opening, you have a shallower depth of field. There's less in focus, just your subject and very small space around the subject, and then everything's blurry in the background. And people say you can't really get blurry pictures, the background blurred out with these type lenses with the f6.3 as the maximum aperture when you're zoomed out. But that's not true, and you can't always do this, so I mean that is somewhat true, but there's ways to get around that if you're closer to the subject or you're zooming all the way out. So the longer the focal length, like 250, which is like 375 millimeter equivalent, that's a long focal length. 375 millimeter equivalent with this 50 to 250 lens, and let's say you're only like 3 feet from it. I mean, the background is going to be really blurry in that situation. So you can get the blurry background with these lenses, but I understand, you may not always be in a situation where you can zoom in closer or get closer to the subject, because that's the ways you could get this shallower depth of field is a wide aperture, being closer to the subject, or using a longer focal length. All three of those things can give you a more blurred background. Trying to not to go too much into the weeds on photography, but I'm just trying to make it, kind of fit this towards everybody. As far as the body goes, let me just kind of get that out of the way before I go rambling off on other stuff. It is a really nice feeling body. It's very ergonomic, has a really good grip. The shutter button and the record button for video. the ISO button and the exposure compensation is all right under your finger, along with the off and on switch. And then you have the front and rear dials, you know, rear dial and front dial. What I usually do is I'm always in aperture priority, so I use the front dial for controlling the aperture and the rear dial for controlling the exposure compensation, just make it brighter or darker. And also have the easy, what is it, Nikon calls it easy exposure compensation or whatever it is. If you're controlling exposure compensation with the rear dial, for example, you can change it to like +1 or whatever, turn the camera off, turn it back on later, and it's reset back to 0. You don't have to remember like, oh crap, I forgot and left it on -1. Now, you know, pictures are darker than I wanted. If you do keep in mind about that though, if you do manually change the exposure compensation with the button up here by the shutter button, that will stick, that'll stay if you turn the camera off and on. But if you use that easy exposure compensation or whatever Nikon calls it, and you're using one of these, you know, like the rear dial to change it, the nice thing about that is that it'll reset. So you know, they've got plenty of buttons. I kind of like this layout on the back. Using my Z7, I kind of trying to keep an eye on the time here so I don't get too far off. It's good for just one-hand operation, the way these buttons are laid out, because you've got your playback button and delete button here, so you can take a picture and then immediately hit the playback button if you want to just check it real quick. And you can press the OK button to zoom in 1:1, you know, 100%, and view it in the viewfinder. So just overall, the way buttons are laid out, I mean, you can see that in other people's videos and Nikon's website. It's just a really comfortable camera, and it is super lightweight. And it does have the little flip down screen. People complain that it flips right down in front of the tripod mount. But, you know, I think for a lot of people that Nikon may be targeting with this camera, you know, they're probably just going to be holding it out with their hand. You know, they're probably vlogging or whatever they're doing, making short videos. I don't think everybody in the world's a vlogger. I mean, I don't really consider myself a vlogger. I just post some videos that I think are hopefully helpful to people. It does flip up like this, but, you know, I don't think the screen flipping down like that instead of flipping out to the side is going to affect too many people. Because again, not everybody's a vlogger. It does have a microphone jack on the side. You can charge your battery with USB, so that's nice. And they do give you a battery charger. A lot of companies, when they're charging batteries through the USB nowadays, they don't give you a battery charger, but they do. They do give you a battery charger with Nikon. And these batteries right now, there's no third-party batteries available yet. And this is the EN-EL25. It's a new battery. And this thing it's a nice battery. It lasts a long time. But it's $70. This thing costs $70, an official Nikon battery for this. But, you know, I only had to pay it once because I have 2 batteries now, and I mark them on the end with a label maker so I know which one's which in case I ever have trouble with it, or I just remember which one I had in there if I'm having both out at the same time. Yeah, so unfortunately there's no third-party batteries just yet. I'm sure there will be, because I like to use not necessarily the third-party batteries too much, but I like to use not just the Nikon charger, but I like to use the Watson Duo charger. I don't have it in front of me here, but it's a little charger. It's about this big, but it has removable plates, and you buy the plates, which are like $1.50 for whatever type of battery you have, and you just put that plate in the battery right on the charger, and you can charge all kinds of different batteries on there from different cameras. This body, I have my little rocket blower out here because this body does not have dust reduction. A lot of times, you know, the cameras will have like a little ultrasonic vibration of the sensor when you turn it off and on to shake dust off or whatever. I haven't noticed anything at all. I usually see dust bunnies on some of my cameras, but I've had the lenses off there several times and taken a picture and specifically looked for, you know, the dust spots in the picture, and I don't see them. You know, it'd be like a dark spot in the picture if you're familiar with what I'm talking about. But just get a good quality blower. Don't buy a really cheap one. This is a rocket blower from, I don't know how you pronounce the name, but Gyotos or whatever it is. I have no idea. But you probably know what these are. These are the little anchors for Peak Design straps. Right now I'm using this smaller one. This is, I can't remember the name of this one. It's not the leash, I don't think, but it's a really small one. I don't think it's more than, I don't even think it's an inch wide. But that's plenty fine for this, even with the 50 to 250, because these things weigh next to nothing. But I probably will get another one of the larger ones. I think this is the Slide Light I think it's a really beautiful strap for one thing, but it's just more comfortable, and even with this little body, it's not really, you know, I don't think it's too big for it, but that'll just be more comfortable. I'll probably end up getting another one of those at some point. Too many little things I need, especially that 24 to 200 that's coming out, because I have a trip to Europe coming this summer and I want to use it for that. Won't be using it for my spring trip. I'll be using the Z7 with the 24 to 120, and I'll take the Z50 with, I don't know if I take both lenses. I'll probably take both lenses because I'm driving. I can take whatever I want. But just kind of, you know, I'm rambling all over the place, but I mean, just back to the body and the camera in general. I think it's a lot better than you may have heard. There's a lot of people that like to get on the internet and just compare specs and whine about, well, the viewfinder. It's only got a 2.36 million dot viewfinder. It's an OLED viewfinder. It does have a flash, by the way. See, I'm just going all over the place. But and this, I do all this in one take. I don't just cut and, you know, like spend here all day making videos. I just want to get it done in one shot. But the viewfinder, the thing about the viewfinder, same thing with the Z7. I mentioned this way back when I did the review of my Z7. The Z7 has a 3.69 million dot or something like that EVF, which is the same as the Sony A7R III. And when I used the Sony A7R III, that had the best viewfinder I had used up to that point. You could zoom in on the picture and everything is crystal clear and looks really nice. You could actually tell that, you know, whether it's in focus or not, you know, and sharp. And when I got the Z7 look through, I'm like, holy crap, it is so much better. I mean, it's just the quality of the optics that Nikon uses in the EVF for these Z-mount cameras, the Z cameras, and the Z7 especially. It's just beautiful, and you know, it's plenty big. You know, the magnification of the viewfinder and the EVF in the Z7, and also on the Z50 they did the same thing. Now this is bigger than like the XT30's EVF. And again, I think the Sony A6400 and all that kind of use the same resolution EVF, 2.36 million dot or whatever. But you know, going back to the optics that Nikon puts in these EVFs, it's just really good. So when you're looking through the EVF, I mean, the color is great. You know, it's super clear, really crisp. I mean, when it's in focus, you know it's in focus. You can actually see, and it's just a really good experience. So, and as far as the image quality, the resolution of the sensor, people keep saying it's a 20 megapixel sensor. I mean, it's 20.9, so I'm going to call it 21 because 0.9 is almost 1, isn't it? So just assume it's 21 megapixels. So that's pretty close to, you know, 24 for the Sony cameras and the XT30, which competes probably with this, maybe. I don't know. As far as price, it does. The XT30 is 26 megapixels. And I admit the XT30 does have an outstanding sensor. I love the sensor in that camera. But I just wasn't, you know, kind of love-hate relationship with the Fuji cameras. I like how they look, but I don't really exactly like how they handle. I mean, it looks nice, but as far as when you're holding it and shooting with it all day, it's just not as comfortable with something like the Z50 with the grip it has. And I still will argue with people all day long that a front and rear command dial right under your thumb and right under your finger is much quicker than trying to manually shift around the aperture on the lens. If you have a lens with an aperture ring, that's the way Fuji forces you to change it with the aperture ring on the lens. I don't think so far, and it could correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think if the lens has an aperture ring on the Fujis, I don't think I've seen a way, and I had the XT30 just recently, to assign the aperture to one of the dials, front or rear dials. That's what I'd like to do, is front dial is aperture and a rear dial exposure compensation. That's how I like to do it. But the image quality, you know, like I said, it has around, if it's the same sensor, DxOMark says the D500 has 14 stops of dynamic range. And so this is probably around 14 stops of dynamic range. So you've got plenty of latitude for pushing the exposure and editing, which I normally don't go more than like 1.5 stops or even 1 usually. Just type pictures I take normally don't need that. Really good high ISO quality, ISO, you know, so you can crank it up and probably, depending on what you're using the pictures for, I mean, you may not even see the grain or noise in it at all. If you're just posting on the internet, you probably wouldn't. And then also if you're printing pictures, you wouldn't see that unless you're printing really big. That's the thing these days. If you're just printing like a 5x7, or trying to keep an eye on the time here, getting close. 5x7s, 4x6, whatever common size pictures, even probably an 8x10, unless it's really high ISO. The cameras these days are so good, you're just probably not going to see that that noise. But yeah, I mean, I've been impressed with the Z50. I'm really happy with it. It does have 2 function buttons here in the front, just like the Z7. Oh, there was one thing I was going to go over. I think you already know I like the camera, and I like the body and the ergonomics and so on, and you've kind of seen them before, and you've kind of seen the body. But it just has U1 and U2 up here, user settings. I like to have at least 3. The Z7 has 3 up there. And what I use those for, I never used to use those in the past, but what I use them for now, like U1, I'll make that my tripod mode basically. So yeah, basically just normally doing regular photography. I'm not doing sports photography, or when I need to change all my settings, to like fast action settings, and then the other settings for, like on a tripod or something, totally different. But the only thing I'm really changing with my user settings is auto ISO, whether it's on or off, making sure the base ISO when I'm in U1, because my U1 is like my tripod mode. So U1 I'll have set so that I have all the settings I normally have. It would be aperture priority, raw files. I'll have the auto ISO off, ISO down to 100 manually set there, and the vibration reduction turned off. So, and then U2, I usually make that my little bit higher ISO. Auto ISO is turned on. I'll make it maybe ISO 3200 is my maximum, and then I'll have the slowest, the minimum shutter speed before ISO starts bumping up. I'll have that set to about 1/15 of a second. So that might be my slow shutter speed indoors in a museum type of setting. I'm comfortable I'm not using a big telephoto lens in a museum, so 1/15 of a second would be totally fine with a camera like this. Hand holding, and auto ISO up to 3200 if I really need it. And yeah, so that's what I'd use that for. And then when just normal shooting, I'm in aperture priority, on the dial here. And the way I usually have that set is auto ISO on, 1600 is max ISO for the auto ISO, probably 1/30th of a second for the minimum shutter speed before it starts cranking the ISO up, and vibration reduction on, of course. And then if I need to, I can change the minimum shutter speed to like a little bit higher if it's, outside and maybe using the telephoto lens zoomed out really far pretty often. I'll maybe push the minimum shutter speed up to 1/50th or 1/60th. I've had, plenty of pictures with the 50 to 150 out at the 250 focal range at about 1/30th of a second, but I think, that's a 375 millimeter equivalent, which is really long, and I feel more comfortable, with my hands holding it maybe out 1/50th or 1/60th of a second, so I've got enough light. And I'm always trying to keep the ISO as low as I can too, just because of the lower the ISO is, the more dynamic range you have. They have the most dynamic range at the base ISO, and as soon as you start going higher on the ISO, then your dynamic range starts to drop. But, just to try to sum it up here, the Z50 and the 2 kit lenses, it's $1,200 in the US. It was like $150 off. I don't know how long that sale will go on. It might be on sale like that forever now, I don't know. But, for that price, I think it's well worth getting both of the kit lenses, because these are, like I'm telling you, these are really much better than you would think, much better optically than you would think, really resistant to flare. There's not hardly any purple or green color fringing. They're very sharp and very lightweight. They're not weather sealed or anything like that, but the body is somewhat weather sealed as from what I understand. The battery door doesn't appear to be, so it's just, use some caution. Don't, shoot out in the rain with it. I wouldn't. Even for weather sealed cameras, I don't shoot in the rain because I don't need to. And why take that chance with all that money if you're just doing it as a hobby like I do? Yeah, so that's really about it. I mean, I personally recommend the Z50 very much. Again, though, if somebody's just starting out or they're buying a brand new camera, they don't have lenses or whatever, and they don't have a preference for whatever system, I think the Fuji X-T30 is still a great camera, great choice. It makes really nice images. I don't like the X-Trans filter too much because it creates larger files and it's harder to edit those slower in Adobe Lightroom, which I use for editing. And it's just more of an Adobe thing. I think something like Capture One Pro does a better job at editing the raw files on the Fuji X-Trans sensors, but I don't really think X-Trans is necessary. I wish they'd just get rid of it and do like they do on their medium format cameras now, and just use the regular Bear type filter and stop with the X-Trans. I think it's just a marketing thing now, and they just can't get rid of it. But yeah, the only thing, if back to starting out, if somebody's starting out and they don't have a lot of lenses or whatever, and they just can start fresh, I think the X-T30 or the Z50 would be a great choice. I prefer the Z50 obviously because I sold my X-T30 and bought this, and now I can share the lenses between my Z7 and Z50, but I think I would still prefer this if I didn't have the Z7. And as far as the Sony goes, in my opinion, having owned the A6400 for a little while and then returning it before, I didn't have a chance to return it because I just didn't like it as much. And I had the A6000 before that a few years back. But that body style, I tried to get used to it again. I just couldn't get used to it. It's got a strange 16:9 aspect ratio screen on the back. The EVF is not inspiring at all. It's off to the side. I kind of like it in the middle too. It's kind of got an older sensor in it, I think, and it's okay. Doesn't have in-body image stabilization either. And the kit lens with that, the 1650 kit lens, is like a power zoom. I don't like power zoom lenses. And it's not as good, not nearly as good as the Nikon lens optically. And the only thing I can see that the Sony like A6400 has going for it is the focusing, like continuous focusing, continuous autofocus and tracking, like eye detect AF and so on. That's really the only thing, in my opinion, the Sony has over a camera like the Z50 or the Fuji X-T30. Other than that, I think the Z50 is just a lot better camera than something like the A6400. To each his own. If you like that body style on the A6400, I mean, there's nothing wrong with it. It can make great pictures just like this. Just pick a good lens, and learn how to use it the best of your ability, and find something interesting to put in front of the camera, and that's all it takes. So we'll try to stop with that. It looks like I'm down to about 2 minutes left or whatever as far as my 30-minute record limit on the Z7. So yeah, we'll stop with that. And I like the Z50, really like it a lot, and I'd definitely recommend it. I don't see anything wrong with it. And just ignore the gear forums and people that have all the complaints about, well, it doesn't have this, or this spec is not as good as the spec on the Fuji or whatever. At the end of the day, most people, I think, are not doing continuous focus out tracking subjects and so on in high-speed shooting. Most people are just, like me, probably just one picture at a time, and the single point AF and the single focus, focus one time, take a picture, and you're done. I think there's a lot of people like that, and cameras like this are great for that. And it does have really good eye detect autofocus anyway. Like the Z7 doesn't have, in video, doesn't have the eye detect autofocus. It has a face detect autofocus, which is following me right now. If I put something in front of my face, then it should go to that, take it away, and come back. But I think people are making a mistake when they claim that the Z7, Z6, and the Z50 don't have good autofocus, because they absolutely do. It's just not as good as like the Sony A6400 or A7R3 and 4 with the real-time autofocus tracking. And again, that's the continuous autofocus tracking, and which is great, but not everybody needs that all the time. So, all right, I'll stop now, and thank you for watching.